I couldn't see his face, not clearly. The rain masked everything, and the fire behind him threw shadows instead of light. We crouched in the ditch for what felt like an hour, waiting for the signal. Wet mud up to our knees, smoke in our throats. No banners, no prayers. Only knives, breath, and the whisper of oaths too old to translate. Our entire bodies were painted black from forehead to fingers. We had not disguised ourselves, we had shed our skin. We had become wolves, not in name, but in essence. The old spirit walked with us, through us. We became werewolves, and we didn't march, we hunted. They came at night, those supply wagons, mules dragging Christian bread and iron down roads they didn't build. Frankish priests in black robes pretending not to fear us. Armed escorts who had never seen a forest god or a warband with nothing left to lose. The man beside me didn't speak, he didn't need to. When he moved, we followed. When he rose from the ditch, we rose with him. When he ran, we ran. The first blade caught a soldier in the throat before he could scream. The second took down the torchbearer, and darkness collapsed in on them like wolves closing a circle. I grabbed the reins of one of the mules as it panicked, stabbing its handler before he could draw steel. The rest of our men moved fast, precise, like they've done this 100 times. Because we had. Blood mixing with mud, screams in Frankish and Latin, the smell of rain with entrails and horsehair. I lost count of how many we killed. I didn't count. It wasn't about the numbers anymore. It was about survival, about vengeance, about not letting the land forget who it belonged to. After the last torch was extinguished and the wet wind blew the steam of the bodies off the road, I sat beside him again, by the edge of a broken cart. He was sharpening his blade, slow, methodical. The blood on his forearm hadn't dried, and neither had mine. I said nothing. I just watched him. And for a moment I thought, I'm not fighting for gods or country. I'm fighting for him. The man who would rather die soaked in blood and mud beside his warband than sit dry in a church pew with his head bowed to a God who never answered us. He looked up once, and I saw it then. Not his name, not his rank, just the weight in his eyes. The burden of memory, of duty, of grief turned into command. No crown, no throne. Just Wittekind, the last king of the free. Before the cross came north, there was the forest. And in the forest, there were men, tribes of them, bound not by scripture, but by oath, by kin, by gods older than Rome. They did not read commandments, they honored blood. They did not kneel before altars of stone, but stood before sacred groves where the spirits of their fathers still whispered through ash and oak. This was the land of the Saxons, untamed, unbroken, and unbound. A world without central crown or cathedral, where law lived in the memory of elders and the honor of warriors. Every free man was a sword-bearing son of the folk. His name mattered only if it carried weight. His worth was not declared by robes or rings, but proven in war, counsel, and sacrifice. Their gods were not meek, they were not forgiving. They did not ask for submission. They demanded strength, courage, loyalty. Woden, the Wanderer King, Thunar, the Hammer-Bearer, Tiwaz, who binds victory with justice. These were not just metaphors. These were the unseen forces behind every storm, every birth, every battle. Their symbols were carved into shields, trees, and the bones of their enemies. And their presence was felt in the sacred sites, the Irminsul among them. Towering wooden pillars linking heaven to earth, tribe to cosmos. In such a world, to fight was not a sin. It was sacred. To die with sword in hand was not damnation. It was duty. And to defend one's land, tribe, and gods was not a choice. It was the highest form of worship. This was not civilization in the Roman sense. It did not build aqueducts or write treaties. It built men. And it remembered its dead. But that world stood in the path of empire. An empire does not negotiate with tribes. It swallows them. Empire always arrives with a banner in one hand and a blade in the other. The Franks brought both. Under Charlemagne, the Carolingian machine surged north not merely to conquer land, but to remake the soul of a people. The Saxons were labeled heathens, their gods demons, their customs barbaric. And so the campaign began, not just of war, but of erasure. The sword came first. Frankish armies poured across the Rhine with iron discipline and Roman tactics, razing villages and burning sacred groves. The Irminsul, pillar of the Saxon world, link between earth and sky, was cut down, not in battle, but as a warning. It was not just a tree, it was a declaration. Your gods are dead. But the Saxons did not kneel. They gathered in the woods, in secret councils and wind-bitten hills. They spoke not of surrender, but of war. And out of that gathering rose one name, Wittekind, a noble of uncertain birth, but of certain fire. A war leader chosen, not by coronation, but by the voice of the tribes. He was not a king in the Frankish sense. He was something older. A shield for the folk, a vessel of ancestral wrath. When the Franks convened puppet councils and baptized turncoat nobles in 777, Wittekind refused to play the part. He crossed into the lands of the Danes, seeking neither escape nor pity, but allies. There, among the free kings of Jutland, he told the Saxon truth, that Rome had returned, wearing a cross instead of an eagle, that the fires of Irminsul were only the beginning. And the North listened. What began as Saxon resistance would echo beyond the Elbe. The stories of forced baptisms, burned groves, and massacred tribes would spread, carried not by scribes but by skalds and seamen. Wittekind's exile planted seeds that would one day become raiders, kings, and vengeance. When he returned in 782, it was not as a fugitive, but as a storm. He moved through fire and fog, forging war bands, refusing treaties, speaking not of theology, but of survival. When Charlemagne imposed his will from stone palaces and Latin scrolls, Wittekind rode beneath the trees older than Christ, rallying sons of Woden to his banner. This was not rebellion, it was resistance. And resistance is a sacred act when the enemy seeks to erase the name of your gods, the face of your dead, and the voice of your land. Wittekind did not fight for domination. He fought for ancestral memory, for the right to bury his dead under their own rights, to name his sons without baptism, to greet the storm as a brother, not a curse, to speak the names of Woden and Thunar without fear of execution. In the age of forced conversions and political saints, he became the last free man standing at the edge of the old world, sword drawn, oath unbroken. The years that followed were carved into the land with blood and fire. From 782 to 785, Saxony became a battlefield not just of armies, but of worlds. On one side, the Frankish Empire, clad in iron and sanctified by Rome. On the other, the scattered but unbroken Saxon tribes fighting not for conquest but for the right to exist on their own terms. But this war had roots in an older wound. Long before Charlemagne, the Franks had already begun to abandon the old gods. By the time of Clovis, they had traded oaths for baptism and set their sights on Roman lands. They were still Germanic in blood, but Roman in soul. They entered Gaul as soldiers, then settlers, then kings. When the Great Cold came around the year 536, the sun dimming, the failed harvests, the famine, the forest tribes suffered deeply. Some vanished, others withered. The Franks, already rooted in the infrastructure of Rome, weathered the storm. With access to grain routes, stone cities, and foreign priests, they multiplied. What should have been a shared struggle became an uneven contest. Fimbulwinter did not create the Franks, but it did sharpen their advantage. The Saxons did not flee. They stayed in the forests. They kept the old ways. They burned their dead beneath the oaks and sang the songs of their fathers even as their numbers thinned. They healed slowly, but they did not forget who they were. And when the Franks returned, it was not as brothers. It was as traitors wearing crowns, demanding tribute in the name of a god their ancestors never knew. Wittekind led not from behind, but from the front. His warband struck with fury, vanishing into the forest and fog before the enemy could retaliate. There were no supply lines, no legions, only men who knew the land as blood knows a vein. Hill forts became strongholds of resistance. Sacred groves became war camps. The old rites continued by firelight even as churches rose over ruined villages. The Franks, frustrated by terrain and defiance, escalated. What they could not control, they destroyed. Crops were burned, elders were hanged, children were taken. And in 782, Charlemagne responded to Saxon victory at Suntel with what can only be called genocide. At Verdun, 4,500 Saxon warriors were slaughtered in a single day. Not in battle, but by decree. Charlemagne's men rounded them up, tied them like animals, and executed them by the thousands for refusing baptism, for raising arms, for staying loyal to their gods. The church would later call this justice. We call it what it was, a massacre. And yet, even after Verdun, the Saxons did not yield. The more the Franks pressed, the more the Saxon resistance transformed. No longer just tribesmen, they became symbols. Men who fought knowing they would not live to see victory, but fought anyway. Mothers told their sons the names of the fallen as prayers. Warriors carried runes into battle that hadn't been carved in a generation. The gods had not abandoned them. The gods had returned to war. Wittekind, scarred and hunted, became more than a man. He became a legend riding on the edge of flame. Each raid, each defiant stand echoed through the valley like a war chant passed down through the bloodline. For a moment, it seemed the Saxons might outlast even Empire. But resistance at that scale cannot last forever. Not when food runs low. Not when allies are bought. Not when winter comes and your enemies arrive not with honor, but with gospel, gold, and gallows. Yet even in those final years, when the fields turned to ash and the tribes were dying faster than they could be born, the Saxons held to the fire. They were betrayed not only by foreign kings, but by their own blood. Franks who spoke their tongue but had given their soul to Rome. They were offered peace if only they would kneel. They were promised mercy if only they would forget. But they did not kneel, they did not forget. They did not hand over their gods to the priests, or their sons to the baptizers. They chose death over submission, and in that choice, they became immortal. For it is not the builders of empire who endure. It is the men who die with their oaths intact, the people who lose everything except their honor. The Saxons bled, but they stood, and that matters more than victory. By the winter of 784, the fighting had changed, not in purpose, but in pressure. The Saxons were still defiant, still blooded, still burning villages in the name of their gods, but the tide was no longer theirs. The Frankish strategy has shifted. They no longer sought just to kill warriors. They sought to break the soul of the tribe. Tribes were split, nobles were bribed, captured boys were baptized by force and paraded as symbols of progress. Forests were burned, not for timber, but to erase the sacred. And Wittekind, once the uncatchable ghost of the North, was now hunted not just by armies, but by time itself. Then the church declared the final act. In 785, with famine rising and allies dwindling, Wittekind surrendered. Or so the Franks claimed. He was baptized publicly, cloaked in white, water poured over his head in the presence of Charlemagne himself. But the truth is this: we have no Saxon record of that day. No witness from his own people, no oath from his own tongue. Only the word of the church. And the church has a history of rewriting resistance as repentance. This is the same institution that claimed Boniface was a martyr, slain by savage pagans while humbly spreading the word. But the truth, buried beneath centuries of liturgy, is far older and clearer. Boniface died while destroying a sacred oak, violating the rights of a sovereign people. He was not martyred, he was executed by men who still remembered their gods. And when the sword could not convert, the pen did. The church later produced the Hellion Gospel, a retelling of Christ as a tribal chieftain and his disciples as warrior thanes. It was not scripture, it was propaganda, a spiritual honey trap designed to seduce the warband and disguise submission as loyalty. So too with Wittekind. Was he broken, or was he protecting what remained? Was his baptism a capitulation or a calculated surrender meant to stop the slaughter of his folk? Was it a spiritual transformation or a ritual of survival forced by blade and famine? Or was it all a fabrication, a holy lie, written to close the story of Saxon resistance with the vow of obedience? We will never know what passed through Wittekind's heart that day. But we know what did not happen. The Saxon tribes did not rise in chorus to embrace the foreign god. The groves did not rejoice. The stones did not sing. No thunder rolled through the forest to mark the victory of Rome. What died that day was not belief, but open resistance. The fire was not extinguished, it was buried. For even after baptism, Wittekind never became a bishop, never built a church, never led a crusade. He disappears from history as if swallowed by the trees. Because some swords are not broken in battle, they are buried beneath oaks, waiting. Perhaps he never submitted at all. Perhaps Wittekind fell in battle, his name carried on the wind while prescribed fiction to cover their failure. Or perhaps he vanished northward once more into the land of the Danes, carrying with him the fire that would one day return as Viking vengeance. The church needed a closure, a clean narrative, a triumph of the cross over the sword. Without it, there was always a chance the Saxon folk might ask, what if Wittekind still rides? And so they baptized him in ink to silence the question. But the forests remember. The hooves of the unseen warband still thunder on cold nights. And sometimes, in the heart of winter, old men still whisper, the rider is not gone, he hunts. The church buried him in myth, but the people raised him in legend. Wittekind vanished from the pages of official history, but not from the hearts of his folk. The priests wrote of baptism, obedience, and peace, but the Saxon memory told another story. They remembered a rider who never came home, a war leader who vanished into the mists, a king who did not die but waited. And in that space, between silence and remembrance, a legend took root. Some say the story was older, that men had long whispered of ghostly riders in winter storming through the skies. But after Wittekind, the tale changed. It grew sharper, closer. The nameless rider was given a name. The warband in the clouds was no longer faceless. They were the sons of Woden, the oath-bound dead, those who fell with blades in hand and waited for vengeance. Wittekind's disappearance didn't invent the wild hunt, but it gave it form. It gave it purpose. It gave the people someone to follow, someone to remember. Through the valleys and forests of Saxony into Thuringia, into Jutland, into the icy shores of Scandinavia, the story of the fallen king echoed like a war horn across generations. Some called him Wittekind. Others gave him no name at all, only the title, the Wild Huntsman, the Dark Rider, the Storm Lord, the ghost of the old gods who rode with him, howling for justice. The church tried to rewrite this too. They called the hunt a demonic procession, a heathen hallucination, a pagan curse. But what it really was folk memory turned into mythic resistance, a refusal to forget. And it didn't end there. In every peasant rebellion, in every tribal whisper, in every story told around firelight, Wittekind reappeared, not in body but in spirit, in the faces of men who would not kneel, in the names of children given quietly, dangerously, in defiance of Christian law, in the carvings hidden in door frames, in the quiet prayers still whispered to Woden in places the priests dared not look. Even the church couldn't contain him. They eventually made him a blessed, half saint, half concession, hoping to domesticate his image, to turn the ghost into a bishop statue, but statues don't ride in storms. Statues don't whisper in dreams. Wittekind became the second Arminius, a folk hero too powerful to erase, too dangerous to sanctify. One who stood not only for Saxony, but for all tribes who remembered the forests, the oaths, the gods, and the war they were never allowed to finish. He did not create the wild hunt, but he may be the reason it endured. And in that, he joined the ranks of all the noble dead who lose the field but shape the future. Like Arminius, like Leonidas, like all who stand and fall but refuse to vanish. He became the proof that you can lose the war and still become immortal. In a time like ours, the first thing a broken young man says is, "Why fight? We're going to lose." He has already been defeated not by war, but by despair. He believes history is finished, that nothing matters, that honor is dead. He has been taught to survive, not to belong, to consume, not to sacrifice. And when he looks to the future, he sees only ashes. But ashes are not the end. Ashes are what remain after fire. And it is fire, not comfort, that built every noble civilization we ever knew. Wittekind did not fight because he thought he would win. He fought because his gods were true, and to betray them would have been worse than death. Arminius did not ambush Rome for personal gain. He did it because freedom was worth bleeding for, even if his own people would one day forget. Leonidas did not stand at Thermopylae because he thought 300 men could stop an empire. He stood because his oaths meant more than his life. And that's the difference between the broken and the noble. The broken ask, "What do I get if I fight?" The noble ask, "What dies if I don't?" You don't fight because you know you'll win. You fight because the thing behind you is worth protecting, even if you're the last one standing. You fight because your ancestors once did, and your sons might need to. You fight because your soul was made for fire, and fire does not negotiate with darkness, it simply burns. These men, Wittekind, Arminius, Leonidas, they were not saints, they were not perfect, but they understood something modern men have forgotten. That to live in truth and to fall with honor is to carve your name into the soul of your people. It is to become more than a man. It is to become memory. And memory is how immortality begins. So when the voice inside you says, "Why fight?" let the ghosts of the old kings answer. Not all kings wear crowns, not all heroes return in flesh, but the true ones, the Harios, the sacred warriors of the folk, they do not fade. Wittekind was such a man. He stood where others knelt. He remembered when others forgot, and he bore the burden of loyalty in an age of betrayal. This is what makes the Harios. Not power, not comfort, not fame, but sacrifice in the service of the eternal. Strength without arrogance, courage without hope, loyalty without reward, duty to blood, to folk, and to gods. Not for gain, but because it is right. Wittekind chose the old gods when the new ones came with chains. He led the last war bands when the other chieftains bowed for land and favor. He vanished into fire and story, not as failure, but as a reminder. The church claimed victory. They baptized the rivers red and declared the forest gods dead. but they lied. Because I agree with a growing number of scholars that it was the slaughter of the tribes, the destruction of Irminsul, the forced baptism, and the death of the free folk under Frankish and Roman crosses that lit the fires in the north. The survivors fled, bleeding and broken, into the mists. They carried not only wounds but stories of betrayal, of holy lies, of sacred groves burned and gods defiled. And those stories reached the sons of Woden who still lived beyond the reach of Rome. And the sons listened. The Viking raids that followed were not random. They were not piracy. They were divine punishment. Punishment for the betrayal of kin. Punishment for the murder of sacred men and sacred oaths. Wittekind's ghost did not vanish. It fled north through the mist and found brothers who still remembered Woden and the Thunderer. And in time, it returned on black sails and winter wind. Despite all the scribes and bishops, despite all the monument and rewritten histories, the spirit of Woden has never been tamed. The Thunderer was never bound. They still live. In the blood of men who refuse to kneel, in the rage of the storm, in the fire behind the eyes of the Harios. And when the wild hunt rides, as it always has, I believe Wittekind rides with it, not broken, not baptized, but crowned in shadow, riding beside the old one who gave him the spear. To remember him is to remember what it means to belong to something greater than your own life. And to invoke his name is to remind the world that the Harios spirit still walks among us, sometimes unseen, sometimes hunted, but never broken. Until next time.